When we speak of the Eucharistic Congress, no longer now will we have to think back to 1932, because this now is the year of the 50th International Eucharistic Congress to be held here in Dublin. And I think this is a very auspicious and important moment for all of us. For the time has come for us now not to look back, but to look to the present and to look to the future. Now is the time for us to live our faith in the modern reality of the world. And so I thought on this year, as we celebrate the 50th International Eucharistic Congress here in Dublin, it is an opportunity for us to recall on this, the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, his great devotion to the Most Blessed Sacrament, and how his devotion brings us to the very heart of his theology. For St. Thomas, theology was not something dead and buried in books. It was not something simply to be debated in academic circles. It was above all that which gave meaning to life, that which gives us life and life abundantly. Thomas the theologian is Thomas the saint. One cannot separate Thomas as his books from Thomas at his prayer. The great teacher teaching or preaching, and the friar in the choir. At the time of the Council of Florence in 1439, the Patriarch of Constantinople said of St. Thomas that he was the most learned among the saints, and so he was simultaneously the holiest of the learned. Le Père Jean-Pierre Torel of Fribourg, in his volume on St. Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, writes, "In the tradition of St. John, the Evangelist, and the Fathers of the Church, Thomas Aquinas' theology is clearly orientated towards contemplation and is as deeply spiritual as it is doctrinal. One could say, I believe, that it is even more spiritual than rigorously doctrinal. The very clarity of his intellectual, philosophical, and theological commitments is immediately reflected in a religious attitude that has no equivalent except that of a mystic, wholly consumed by love of the absolute." Thomas himself bears witness to this at the end of his life, when he leaves the straw of words for the grain of definitive reality. His own personal example shows us that there is no need to add to his theology, because it already leads to piety. We only need to pursue to the full extent what the theology itself requires of us. And so at this celebration of the Feast of St. Thomas, I would like briefly to look at some of the recorded episodes in this own personal example of St. Thomas that Father Torel speaks about. First of all, to quote from William of Tocco, one of Thomas's early biographers, Tocco says, "He, St. Thomas, offered one Mass a day, if he was not prevented by ill health, and assisted at a second, in which he often served at the altar. During Mass, he often would be seized by such strong feelings of devotion that he dissolved in tears, because he was consumed by the sacred mysteries of the great sacrament and invigorated by its offering." Bernard Guy, one of his earliest biographers, also writes that at the moment of the elevation of the sacred host, St. Thomas could be heard to say the words of the Te Deum, "You, Christ, are the King of glory, eternal Son of the Father." So here we see, my brothers and sisters, the picture of the Master of Theology in an order which so valued study that it allowed the rule of dispensation from certain choral duties in the interest of sacred study, serving at the altar of a second Mass, very often offered by his secretary, Blessed Reginald of Pierno. The Master becomes the altar boy. Humility and theology go hand in hand. It is told that one day Thomas asked his master Albert the Great where he should study theology, and Albert brought him to the foot of the crucifix and pointed to the ground. "Here," he said, "on your knees." And each day Thomas did precisely this, as he served Blessed Reginald's Mass. And so there are accounts of this wonderfully erudite and clear-thinking theologian crying like a baby when he celebrated the Mass and received the sacred host at Holy Communion. A man taken over, dare we say, consumed by love. Was this simply his Italian temperament, or was it the overflowing into his body of the deep theological understanding of his mind? Thomas the theologian, who is truly a saint united to and in the sacred mysteries. St. Thomas's secretary, Blessed Reginald, said of the Master that he solved his intellectual problems not so much with thought as with prayer. And we know from various accounts of his life that often when he was wrestling with difficult theological problems, Aquinas would rest his head against the tabernacle door and with tears beg for inspiration. As one commentator has written, a careful and attentive reading of the texts of Aquinas reveals that this mystical passion, this ecstatic response to God, paradoxically suffuses all that Thomas wrote in his admittedly dry and laconic style. And so the academic theologian, who shows himself to be one of the best, if not the best, poet of the medieval world, when he was asked by the Pope to compose an office for the feast of Corpus Christi, of the Laudazion, the sequence for the Mass of that feast, the eminent Cambridge scholar of medieval poetry, F.E.J. Raby, says, "The verses have an austerity and grandeur which no Latin poet of the Middle Ages ever equaled." Or as G.K. Chesterton said of the composer of the Corpus Christi liturgy, was not merely what even the wild and woolly would call a poet, he was what the most fastidious would call an artist. And so let us recall for a moment the events surrounding the writing of this theological masterpiece, yet poetry, the liturgy of the Feast of Corpus Christi. In 1263, 1 Peter of Prague was celebrating Mass in Bolzano, doubting the truth of the real presence. And as he lifted up the sacred host after the consecration, he saw blood flowing freely from the consecrated host onto the corporal. He went immediately to the Pope, Urban IV, at Orvieto, to confess his lack of faith and to tell of the miracle. The Pope asked to see the blood-stained corporal. On seeing it, the Pope, as it were, set a challenge for the two great theologians in his court, asking them to compose an office for the new feast of Corpus Christi. And so St. Thomas of Aquino and St. Bonaventure, our brother Franciscan, set about their tasks. On the appointed day, Thomas read first, and as he read the last verse of the hymn for Matins, the Panis Angelicus, it is related that Bonaventure began to cry, and people heard him crumbling up his parchment and let it fall to the ground. Is this a true story? Who knows? But today, let us celebrate it. The theology of these sacred pieces, I believe, have never been surpassed. And if we as Dominicans are to celebrate fittingly the Eucharistic Congress, what better way than to again become familiar with these masterpieces and to pray them and to sing them and to meditate on them. I remember once giving a retreat in a Benedictine monastery, and one of the monks said to me that he had meditated for years on the Adoro Te Devote. And he thanked me as a Dominican for St. Thomas, as if I had anything to do with it. But I thanked him as a Benedictine for introducing Thomas to the beauty of the liturgy and theology as a boy at Monte Cassino. For surely this early experience of prayer and liturgy must have left an indelible mark on the psyche of the young boy searching to know quid est Deus, what is God? For Thomas, this search to know God is the purpose of theology and the true search for life. It brings us to another incident in the life of St. Thomas. I think it was after he'd finished the tract on the Most Blessed Sacrament for the Summa Theologiae. And we are told that he laid the tract on the altar before the crucifix and asked the Lord if it was acceptable. And he heard a voice speaking from the crucifix, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What would you have?" And he gave the famous reply, the reply that is forever in stone in his statue overlooking the sanctuary here. A reply which I believe brings us to the very heart of the Thomistic search in theology. Non alium nisi te, Domine. I ask for nothing, only you, my Lord. This reply brings us to the communion of Thomas's theology and spirituality, his learning and his piety. The theologian Robert Barron writes in his book, Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, that this dialogue between the crucifix and Thomas, he says, is a sort of interpretative key to the whole of Aquinas' life and thought. He wanted nothing more than Christ, nothing other than Christ, nothing less than Christ. He strove to walk in the path of discipleship, and in all his writings to show that path to others. How fitting, therefore, that we should celebrate St. Thomas's feast day only a few days after the conversion of St. Paul, for as we know, both men were captivated by Christ. Barron, in that same little book, says that after reading Thomas, my life began to change, he says, and more than my mind was illumined. I discovered, in short, what Thomas himself would have taken for granted. Good theology is mystical, prayerful, and transformative, and its final purpose is to know God. That is to say, to be with God in intimate communion. We are told by the chroniclers that when Thomas himself received Holy Communion, he prayed, "Most loving Father, granted your most beloved Son, whom I now receive veiled, I may one day behold face to face forever." Here we have in a nutshell the final stanza of the Adoro Te Devote. And so, my brothers and sisters, as we prepare to celebrate this year of the Eucharistic Congress, I want to return to something that Father Pierre Torel says in his book, Christ and Spirituality in St. Thomas Aquinas. In this recently published book, this noted Aquinas scholar speaks of what he calls theological affectivity, which he describes as charity present through a living faith. Torel says this theological affectivity is necessary for an authentic practice of theology. He writes, the title, Theology and Sanctity, imposes itself by meditating on the simple fact that theology is ordered to the contemplation of God, which begins and ends in love. If theology is so ordered, then the theologian cannot remain idle if he or she wishes not to be counted among those who say but do not do. The theologian must strive to meet the demands of his or her discipline. And so, my brothers and sisters, today, as a studium, as we celebrate this great feast, and as we claim to be the disciples of St. Thomas, of him who is the greatest of the theologians, let us always remember that he is also a great saint. Indeed, because he was a great theologian, he is a great saint. And because he is a great saint, he is a theologian. To sit with him only at our desks and not to kneel with St. Thomas in adoration is to fail to know Aquinas or to practice seriously the art of theology. And so, as we celebrate the 50th International Eucharistic Congress here in our city, it is a fitting reminder to us all of the role which prayer and adoration plays, not simply in the life of the Church, but also in the life of a truly serious theologian. The Congress is not simply something happening on the other side of the city in the RDS, but rather it is a summons to the whole of the Catholic Church here in Ireland, and indeed of the world, to be reminded and renewed of the role of Christ as the centre of the Church's life. And so for us Dominicans, I think we can take no better role model as to how to celebrate this Eucharistic Congress than to again become familiar with the writings and the prayers, the hymns of our brother St. Thomas Aquinas. And it is Thomas in his theology who teaches us how we are to be part of the new church, the renewed church,